This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the 1978 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We will be talking with Eric McGill about why he and I think it is a great film. My guest is Eric McGill. He's a film critic online. He has his own website, emcgill.com, is it?
That's correct.
And we will be talking with him about the 1978 version of a classic sci-fi film and trope, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So welcome, Eric. Like I like to do, I want to give my guests a chance to introduce themselves, what they think is important about themselves, and its relation to the topic at hand. So if you could give a little background about yourself, when you might have first seen this film, and your relationship to it within all the versions of the Body Snatchers theme.
Yeah, sure. I'm Eric McGill, like you said, and I'm a novelist, a science fiction novelist specifically. I'm also a big film student. I studied in college to become a filmmaker. Didn't quite work out that way because life happens. And now I have a very successful YouTube channel called The Unapologetic Geek, where I critique old sci-fi movies, including Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Yeah, and I think my first experience was growing up. I saw this version first, the 1978 version. That was the very first one I saw. And it really had a lingering impact on me. It was scary. I mean, it was creepy without being scary. And I think that really affected me to know that that's a kind of storytelling you can do. And it's actually very hard to pull off. And yeah, I think it's always been an influence on me. And I've seen the previous one, the original. I've read the novel that it's based on, the Jack Finney novel, Body Snatchers. And I've seen the more recent remakes. Yeah. I think there was one in 1990 and one in 2004 or something. And I'm happy to talk about those too.
Yeah, there's also sort of quasi-body snatcher films, like what was the one with Roddy Piper, They Live? It's sort of like a body snatchers kind of film. But can I just ask how old you are? Because I'm 57, so I remember when this film, the 78 version, came out in theaters. Were you born then, or?
No. I was actually born the same year that it came out. I was born in 78, so I'm 43. I'm about to be 44.
Okay, so you did not see it
42, in the... 43. I can't even keep up anymore.
Jack Finney's novel, let's talk about that a little bit. Now, just before we started, I asked if it was a short story or a novel. Something tells me, 2001, A Space Odyssey was originally based on a short story called The Sentinel. I'm thinking, I could be wrong, maybe you can correct me. Was the novel also an expanded version of a short story? Because I have it in the back of my mind that it started out as a short story. Maybe I'm wrong. Do you know offhand?
My memory, which again is possibly flawed too, my memory is that it was a serialized novel that he published it in like short story magazines, a piece at a time. So maybe that's what you're getting your wires crossed with.
So let's talk a little bit about the novel. I did read it too many years ago. I'm talking in the 70s, probably. I think it was re-released at the time the film was released, this version of the film.
Right.
I remember it being a good, solid story, but I do remember thinking I liked the 56 film, which I obviously saw first on old, early 70s reruns, spooky chiller theater kind of thing. But I thought at that time of the three versions, the novel, the 56, and this one, that this was clearly the best iteration of that. So where do you put, say, the first three, the two films and the novel? What are their pros and cons, would you say?
Well, I mean, like you, I do think the 78 one is the best, and we'll get there. But just starting with the novel, it is a great idea, and it has some really good moments, but it has a terrible ending. It has a happy ending, which doesn't fit the story at all. And I don't know, it doesn't really go too in-depth into the thematic possibilities of Body Snatchers, which, is a big part of it. It's really just a book about divorce and dealing with divorce. It's not bad by any stretch, but it doesn't hold a candle to either the 56 version or the 78 version. The 56 version, I do like how it manages to boil down the story to its bare essentials, and it tries to have the less uplifting ending. I know originally when they first filmed it, it originally ended with Kevin McCarthy screaming in the camera, you know, you're next," and it was supposed to just cut to black, and that was the
Yeah.
end of the movie. The studio mandated that they tack on at the beginning and the end a little bit of a framing device to make it seem like more of a happy ending. Um, but even with that, I really, really do appreciate the 56 version, and I want to make that clear. I really like it a lot. Um, but the 78 version, I feel like captures the tone so perfectly. And you can read into it so many different ways. It has the same basic plot outline of the 56 version,
Yeah.
which is superior to the book. Um, but it sets it in a big city, which I think your mileage may vary depending on if you like big city life or if you like small town life. Because the original, the 56 version, really does kind of lean into the small town life being creepier. Whereas the 78 version, the San Francisco, I feel like really captures that paranoia you get in large groups of people where everybody's kind of dehumanized just because there's so many of them. Um, so yeah, those are my brief thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency to look back at the golden age of sci-fi horror of the 40s, the 50s, let's call it, uh, and over-romanticize these films. There were certainly great films. For example, to give an example of another film that was remade from the 50s in the early 80s was the original Thing. Now, I actually think the original Thing was superior to the gory 82 Thing because it became just sort of, I mean, yes, they weren't CGI, but it became for me just too much about the gore, too much about shock for shock's sake, and that's why I think that the 50s version is superior. Here it's the other way around for me because I think that the 50s version was so obviously about the communists and Joe McCarthy and red baiting and whatnot. Whereas here you're getting a post 60s, post Watergate, post Vietnam, the late 70s malaise. People are wondering where the country's going, what's going on. The pod people here, for example, they're not the only ones that are zombies. It seems that most of San Francisco then are filled with zombies who don't give a damn. You know, it's the rise of consumerism in that. And so who really cares if they're humans or pod people? There's not a hell of a lot of difference. And I think that gives a layer of depth that the earlier version didn't. What is your take on that?
No, I agree. I feel like the 70s version, it really does tap into that sense of, well, you said malaise. I think it's more like just internal isolation among a crowd, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like and like you said, everybody already seems like they're kind of zombified before the movie even starts. And a lot of there's a lot of just weird, odd, off-putting things happening in the background because it was filmed guerrilla style. A lot of these people didn't even know they were being filmed. It's just weird stuff that happens in the city. Um, and everybody just feels off kilter, and the camera's off kilter and everything. Um, and I feel like that really taps into the kind of paranoia and just sense of dread about the future that people felt in the 70s to a certain extent.
So before we get into talking about the basics of the plot, let's talk about some of the main characters. There are de facto, let's see, five main characters. There's Donald Sutherland, Brooke Adams as sort of the main quote-unquote couple. There's Jeff Goldblum, and Veronica Cartwright as the secondary couple. And then there's Leonard Nimoy. So let me just start with Leonard Nimoy because I think he's absolutely fantastic in this role. I mean,
Oh, he's great.
he's playing one of these 1970s Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Let's all be having guru types, and it's so different than Mr. Spock, which you know he can't get away from that shadow. But I think this is from what I've seen, and I remember seeing him in some early stuff in the '50s, pre-Star Trek, and one or two roles other than Mission Impossible, the TV show he was on.
Right.
And I think this is his best non-Spock role, non-Star Trek role, and I don't think it's even close. What is your take on Nimoy's performance?
No, I do agree, and I think it's really hard to separate him from the context of Spock because
Yeah.
this character in the beginning, like you said, is almost like the exact opposite. He's a pop psychologist, you know, and then at
Well,
the
he's
end,
a snake. He's snake's oil salesman,
oh,
basically, too.
totally, he's a complete snake oil salesman. But by the end, when you find out he actually is a pod person and has been for a while, um, he's coming across as emotionless and just dry and scary, which is kind of like Spock, but more like a weird inverse of Spock. I mean, he's still like emotionless, but he has no humanity at all.
Mm.
And I think that makes him really interesting as a character, as Leonard Nimoy. But even if you can divorce him from Star Trek, his performance is really interesting because he is so alluring and so charismatic.
Yeah.
In a way that, like, I mean, you can read and you can see that he's obviously a snake oil salesman. You wouldn't buy anything he's selling, but at the same time, he's kind of hypnotic, and you can kind of see how people would fall for him.
Now, the question that has often been asked, and you bring this point up by saying, do you think that he was a pod person from his first appearance in the film? Because if so, he seems still a bit more charismatic and less wooden than, say, the boyfriend that we see as the first pod person, Elizabeth Driscoll, Brooke Adams' boyfriend there. Or does he, or is there a moment like 2/3 of the way or halfway through his performance where he obviously has become a pod person? What is your take on when he becomes poddy?
It's hard. I mean, like, there's not a lot of evidence in the actual movie to say one way or another. But for me, in my own little headcanon, I would say he becomes a pod person somewhere between his introduction and when he shows up at the Belichick's bath to find the body that's not there. I think that at that moment, he is already a pod person. And everything he does from that point forward is kind of, it's designed to get them isolated to a place where he can actually convince them to just just go to sleep. Even so far as injecting Elizabeth with, not injecting, but giving her sedatives.
Yeah. So let's talk about the secondary couple, Veronica Cartwright and Jeff Goldblum. Neither of them were big stars at that time, and Veronica never really became, but the following year she obviously had a very similar role in that she was constantly screaming in Alien. And then Jeff Goldblum took off in the 80s. I think maybe he was he in Annie Hall in that
Annie Hall, yeah, that was his first real role.
Okay, that was his first role. This was second or third role then.
Something like that.
I think they make a quirky kind of artsy fartsy type couple. What is your take on both of their performances?
They totally feel like San Francisco Soho types, you know, bohemians. He's a writer, but he's a struggling writer. He's obviously never really gotten any success, and he's very, very jealous of Kibner, Leonard Nimoy's character. And I love that scene where he walks into the bath and he just throws Kibner's book on the ground. And you actually like see him tear up at some point, which I think is interesting. He really gives him a lot of dimension as opposed to just being a jealous asshole. He actually like has a heart. And he does try to sacrifice himself later in the movie. So I think as Jeff Goldblum, he's very Jeff Goldblum. He's an actor who can't really get away from that. But he plays really well. I like when they're at the book party and you see him in the reflection in the funhouse mirror and he's just talking over Donald Sutherland's character, even as Donald Sutherland's trying to talk to the police on the phone. He's always quirky and it works really well. And Veronica Cartwright, she was a child actress from a long time back.
Sound of Music? No, that was her sister. Was it her?
Yeah, I don't remember.
Yeah, it was Veronica. Okay. No, Veronica was not in. Nancy Cartwright, who was on Lost in Space, was in Sound of Music.
Right, okay. I don't really remember. So just know that she was around. But yeah, she's not that interesting of a character. The only interesting thing about her, I think, is the fact that she's the last one who survives.
Well, let me just ask you, because she does it. I find it interesting that she's the last survivor. Whether she's the actual last person in San Francisco or the world at that point, who knows? But she's the guy. She's the character who's reading a lot of these old sci-fi books. She mentions the guy. She mentions a classic 20s, 30s sci-fi writer. She mentions some of the stuff about UFO sightings in the 50s and whatnot. So she's already prone to believing that the worst is going to come, and yet she ends up the survivor. So there's something interesting about her paranoia, if you will. This helps her there.
Yeah. I think she even had a line at one point where she was talking about aliens coming down and having sex with monkeys and making the human race.
Yeah, right.
But like, Yeah, I mean, of all the characters, her paranoia seems the most justified, even if she seems kind of crazy and nutty. So yeah, I see that.
So now Brooke Adams, she looked like she was going to be a real big superstar in the late '70s. She had this. She did Days of Heaven with Terrence
Right.
Malick, which is another great film, but in a totally different vein than this one. Um, I don't think she ever became a really big star though, but she is quite good in her role too. She's sort of one of the assistants at the place where Donald Sutherland at the San Francisco, what is it, the public
Health
health department,
department. Yeah.
and you really get a sense of who she is and the dynamic she has with the Sutherland character. There's that scene where she wiggles her eyes. You can tell that
Right.
these
Right.
people are sort of intimate, and they know, and you know that that had to be stuck in there simply because the actress could
Yeah,
do
it
that.
was completely improvised. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is your take on her performance?
She's very warm, and she and Donald Sutherland, despite there being like a 14-year age difference, they have a lot of chemistry, which
Yeah.
is one of my complaints about the '56 version. I didn't feel like Kevin McCarthy and Dana Winter had much chemistry, but these two do, and I think a lot of that is Brooke Adams.
Yeah.
She's very easy to like, and she never goes hysterical. She never turns into a stereotype. Um, so yeah, I love her. She's great.
Now, Donald Sutherland's character, Matthew, uh, he's the de facto stand-in for the Kevin McCarthy character in the '56 version, and I think he does an excellent job too. This is, I think, one of his better roles. He sort of burst onto the scene with MASH, Robert Altman in 1970, and he did some good stuff. He played Sam Spade, was it? In He played one of the classic detectives. He had another few roles, but this is a role where I don't know if you're familiar with 1970s sort of cops and robbers detective shows like Peter Falk in Columbo or James Garn in the Rockford Files. But he has that feel of that 1970s kind of hero. The stuff with is it a rat turd or is it a caper? Eat it.
Right.
You have that funny, quirky kind of this guy. He feels real. So, what is your take on his performance?
No, he is. He's very grounded in reality, and I think he lends a lot of the movie's realism. I mean, it's shot in that '70s realist style, but Donald Sutherland, if he had played it up in any way, if he'd overacted in any way, it would have shown up on screen, and it would have taken you out of it. Um, but he works because not only is he, very like down to earth guy, but he's also obviously in love with Brooke Adams's character, Elizabeth. Um, and trying his hardest to weigh that against being a good friend, um, and that kind of interplay goes throughout the entire movie until the end. But also he's trying to reason things out from a rational perspective the entire time. And mostly eventually I think eventually he gets to a point where he just knows he has to escape, that there's no way to beat this. And then Elizabeth dies, and he, has his moment where he blows up the factory or whatever it is. Um, and Donald Sutherland did all of his own stunts too, by the way. I don't know. He is very good, and I think he has a lot more dimension than some of his other famous roles. Like just a year or two earlier, he'd done Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now, which is a great movie, and he's good in it. But he's not the same. He doesn't have as much to chew on in that movie than he does in this one.
Yeah, I was recently watching a few what we call the British kitchen sink dramas of the '50s and '60s with my wife on the Criterion Collection channel or the Criterion channel, and this is a very much if if we took away the premise that aliens were slowly creeping into our lives, this could play out as very much a slice of ordinary life in San Francisco in the late '70s. It really just feels like you're there, and it's within just 2 or 3 scenes. When the Chinese washerman says, "That is not my wife" or whatnot. It has a kind of quirky reality to it because many men, Chinese or otherwise, have said when their wife has spooked them in some way, or that's not really my wife, someone's been replaced. So it plays off of those kinds of little marital foibles, the stuff with his shirt too, and him showing her that, oh no, I actually put that stain there myself. I'm sure it's whatever was coffee or whatnot.
And she's like, no, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, there were so many little scenes that are jammed into the first, say, half hour to 40 minutes that by the time we veer over and there's no going back, we're definitely in a sort of thriller mode. We are totally, I think, with the characters. We are totally buying in and on their side.
Oh, completely. And it's able to establish that in the very beginning that the reality is already a little warped just by little simple things like putting Robert Duvall in a priest costume and having him on a swing, and
Yeah.
just it's not explained. It's not even part of the plot. It's just there,
It's
as I
very
understand it.
Exorcist like,
It is. And so it establishes that even if this hadn't happened, there's just something wrong, underlying
Yeah.
wrong about society in San Francisco in the 70s, which, you know, my parents grew up or my parents lived in San Francisco in the 70s. So I wasn't born there, but I almost was.
Eric, let's talk about the premise of the movie. The idea of what is called panspermia, that life, did not originate on Earth, but, has floated around in space and that's very much behind this. It has that sort of Eric von Daniken feel too of ancient astronauts, that maybe these pod creatures, pod people, whatever you want to call them, are not the first to have visited here. Um, and yet you kind of find it far more believable than you would something like one of the 90s blockbusters like Independence Day. And it feels more real, to me at least, than Star Trek or Star Wars, where you have all of these humanoid kind of aliens. I mean, uh, this actually brings to mind for me, I don't know if you know Hoyle's The Black Cloud novel. Um,
Don't know that one.
yeah, it's about a giant cloud in outer space that's sentient, or Solaris,
Oh, Solaris, of course.
Lem's novel, and the
Yeah.
two adaptations of intelligent sentient ocean. You get the sense that, at least I get, that this creeping otherness is far more likely to happen, however unlikely it might be in reality, than we are here to conquer the earth and landing in front of the UN building or something. So what do you think about the initial premise? And as you recall, are there any slight differences between the 56 film version?
Um, yeah, I don't completely remember the 56, the origin of the pods. I know they came from outer space, but I
Yeah.
don't remember if there
Okay.
was that like goo from this one. In the 78 version, I like the idea that it's just this goop that comes down, and it seems to at first assimilate plant life so that it can form the actual pods,
Mm.
and then the pods can assimilate people.
Ah,
And I
that's a good
like that a
point.
lot of that goes relatively unexplained, that it's
Mm.
just kind of in the background, and it shows you the life cycle of these pod people kind of just as the plot progresses. Like you don't even find out how it gets rid of people until the very end, until Brooke Adams' character
Mm.
disintegrates in front of him. Um, and I think that that does definitely feel more real than, even say like Gort and
Yeah.
Klaatu
Klaatu.
coming
Yeah.
down, stuff like that. Anytime it's a human or even a guy in a suit, it just doesn't feel the same. It always feels a little like a cheat. Like the writers just couldn't come up with anything better. Um, and here you don't get that, and you don't need a big budget to pull it off either, because this movie did not have a big budget like at
Yeah.
all.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, because maybe they really aren't pod people, but pod creatures. You have the one where the pod lands on the dog and the hobo in one of the pods, and it mixes its genes apparently, and it becomes a dog man.
Yeah,
Um,
one of the creepiest images of the whole movie. Yeah.
and I think one of the creepiest images that you're going to see in all of sci-fi. But so. The film opens, we get that the flowers are blooming, these odd flowers. People are just barely taking notice of it. Uh, you have Matthew and Elizabeth there at the health department doing whatever they're doing, and you see a little bit of their relationships with some of their co-workers. And what is the first moment of that film where we get the sense that, oh, it's about to happen then? You know,
That's a good question. There's a lot of shots when Brooke Adams is going home and she's with her boyfriend, who
Jeff.
we kind of figure out pretty early on is already a pod person.
Yeah.
But a lot of that is helped by the camera angles. Like you see, there's this very voyeuristic camera style
Yeah.
where you'll like see them having an argument on the bed through reflection down a hallway.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. I think primes you for that sense of unease that something bad is happening right now.
Yeah.
And it feels like you've got this normal domestic situation, but at the same time there's something otherworldly happening. And I think that's one of the ways the tone of this movie works so well.
And the boyfriend Jeffrey is, as far as we know, he's the first named character that we know of that becomes a pod person. It's arguable that the priest that you mentioned by Duval could be a pod person. Or maybe one of the kids that is seen playing with the flowers.
Or even the teacher who's like encouraging them to pick the flowers.
And then after we get the introduction of Elizabeth and Matthew, the two main characters, we get here bruited David Kibner, the famous psychologist, the Nimoy character, and he's off screen for about 20 minutes before he comes on, but he's talked about as some kind of expert. And this brings in the two other characters, Belichick's, the husband and wife team, with their quirkiness. What is your sense of these characters, the Matthew and Elizabeth, in relation to the Belichicks? Because they seem to bond quite quickly in the movie, even before the stuff with the pod people happens.
Well, you do feel like Sutherland's character and Goldblum's character have been friends for a long time, and they've just known each other forever. And so, just by osmosis, the two couples come together and are able to interact in a familial, friendly way. Even though I think Brooke Adams is just meeting them for the first time, they're still able to assimilate with their friend circle just fine. One thing I wanted to note was right at the very beginning when you're first introduced to Donald Sutherland, and he's doing the thing with the is this a caper or is this a rat turd? That's kind of giving the whole game away. Like, is it what it appears to be or is it something else,
So we have also, too, then several instances that grow through the film where Matthew keeps on relying on authority. Matthew, of the four of them, seems to be the most dependent upon authority, whether it's the authority of David, as we presume he's a PhD, whether it's the authority of the police or his own department. At one point he says, should I have my boss, the head of the department, declare a state of emergency in San Francisco? To what degree do you think that, do you think that Matthew's own, I don't know if we'd call it gullibility, but I guess his unwillingness to challenge authority, does that play a part in the film, or is it basically going to happen one way or the other?
No, I do think it plays a big part in the film, and I think the film goes out of its way to highlight it. Like that montage where he's talking to as many different people as he can. He gets to the mayor's aide and everything, and he's even meeting the guy in the park. He's trying to find authority that can deal with the situation because he himself is an authority. He works for the health department. He has the power to shut down restaurants. But I think a lot of that reflects the kind of socio-political atmosphere of the time. Like this is, post 60s, people lost a lot of faith in the government, a lot of faith in our institutions just in general, like throughout the 60s and 70s. And by the late 70s, there was none left, really. So the idea of Donald Sutherland having to learn that kind of disillusionment as the story goes on, I think relates to a lot of Americans at the time.
There's also the scene where Elizabeth is following her boyfriend Jeffrey as he meets up with all sorts of people. She follows him through abandoned parking lots. She follows him through what seems like burned out buildings, through a shopping mall, up and down streets and whatnot. The whole film is filled with images, not only of the pod people, but people not trusting what there is. She's actually questioning things. She immediately says, Jeffrey is not himself, and And then you get the introduction of Kibner, and he comes on very much as one of these 1960s 70s guru type. You know, you could easily see him being like, what was that cult where, you know, the UFOs are going to come down and
Oh
take
yeah,
us to somewhere.
the
There was
Heaven's
20
Gate
some,
people.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
Heaven's Gate. You could easily see him becoming a Heaven's Gate type of person. And there's some interesting scenes when at this bookstore, I believe it is, where the four main characters first meet Kibner, and you know he's going through. There's a woman who believes her husband isn't her husband, and clearly he has become a pod person then. Um, uh, but the whole scene really plays out interestingly because Kibner. I think at that time Kibner might still be himself. He has a human kind of arrogance that the pod people
Totally.
don't.
I
Um,
think so too.
yeah, what do you think about that initial Kibner at the book signing
I think the
deal?
fascinating thing about Kibner in that scene, and when he walks outside and he explains that he's actually had multiple patients do this in the last couple of weeks, and that this is like a new thing, and he's not sure what to make of it. But still, he refuses to accept that he doesn't know what the answer is, that he doesn't know how to deal with it. Like he's absolutely convinced that his method of tackling the problem of confronting the wife in the bookstore and having her reconcile with the husband right there in front of all those people, that is the way to solve this, and that there's nothing else to it, that it's just some kind of psychological break that people are having. um, so yeah, like you, I really believe that he's a human at this point and that he's acting like a human because of all that arrogance, because of that assumption that if there's something weird happening, he knows what it is and he knows how to solve it because he's the guy, he's the guru.
So when we get back to the Belichicks, we see that there's one of the mud bath men seems to be already a pod person, and he then has put in a handful of pods into the mud bath. It seems so. I would presume the next person that takes a mud bath is going to be podified or something, because you know we do see uh, we see what Belichick himself, Goldblum's character, his pod is maybe about 50 away there. There's the nosebleed that both the pod and he get. Um, and then it seems that throughout the film, though, the pods seem to be replacing people quicker and quicker because Belichick's pod seems to take an hour or two before it forms. Matthew seems to only be asleep when he nods off at his place. He only seems to be asleep for 3, 4, 5 minutes. And
Yeah.
I mean, yes, there are some cuts, but the implication is it seems to me that the pods are learning how to reproduce human form better.
Well, also, once they have infiltrated and they've already got a lot of people involved, they're able to take larger pods
Yeah,
from place to place instead of the little tiny ones that you start with in the beginning of the movie.
yeah.
And I think the larger pods accelerate the process, make it a lot
Mm.
faster. That's my kind of post hoc explanation for that. But you're right; they do seem to accelerate. Like the entire invasion is accelerating as the movie goes on because things like that are speeding up. And even the assimilation itself only takes minutes by the end. Like
Uh,
Brooke Adams, I think she gets assimilated in like 2 minutes at most.
yeah. Now, there is the famous scene with Kevin McCarthy, the original protagonist of the 56 film, where he's being chased apparently by pod people. And what's weird is the pod people are an odd sort of, they're not really zombies. Uh, in some sense, you could argue they're sort of like, I guess we'd call them vegan vampires. They're not out the blood, but they're vampiric in certain ways, and yet they move like the fast zombies in that chase scene with Kevin McCarthy. Of what is it? 28 Hours Later, was that the franchise where we first got fast zombies?
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
that's where it starts. Yeah.
So what is your take on that scene where he all of a sudden, I mean, because Matthews already got broken window, but he's boom on top of the car, and he's basically saying the exact same thing that ends the film before
Right, right.
addition.
You're next, right.
Yeah,
Um I think that the pod people, they don't want to attack people out in the open unless they're a real threat. Like this guy's obviously a real threat, but at the same time, this scene is highlighting, if you're in a big city, you're going to see crazy people. Crazy people are going to shout at you. That's just a thing that happens.
yeah.
And they even react to it like that. They react to it like, oh, should we help this guy? Or, oh, he died. And then they never mention him again. Well, he tries to call the cops about it later,
Yeah.
but they don't really make that big of a deal of it. because it's just a day in the life in San Francisco. But yeah, then you've got these pod people, and are they a hive mind or aren't they? It's kind of up in the air. But they definitely do move in flocks. You see
Yeah,
it multiple times in the movie, especially when they're chasing people.
yeah.
Once they have you in their sights, they have a hard time letting go of you.
Yeah, and they also, I don't know, you're probably familiar with the Carnival of Souls, that
Oh, totally.
1962 film, another great film that I actually did a show on too. They sort of move like that. They sort of swarm like, I guess we call them the ghouls from that movie, upon people, especially when uh, Jeff Goldblum and Veronica Cartwright run off in the
Run
night there.
away. Right.
But yeah, that scene with the Karen McCarthy, because I don't think the character is ever named. And some people have said that the two films actually take place in the same universe. That the '56 invasion failed, and then the '78 invasion, succeeds, and it's the same character. What is your take just on that little bit of pop trivia?
I think that's a fun theory, but it requires a lot of stretching
Yeah,
to accept it. I mean, I like it. I love a good theory like that. But it would have to be that Kevin McCarthy's character had been kept under wraps for 2 decades
yeah,
and somehow escaped and was trying
yeah.
to warn the world that there was another invasion coming.
Yeah,
Um,
and how would he
I
know if he was in an asylum?
exactly. Like I don't know. I think there's a fun story in there, but I don't think there's anything within the actual text to support it.
So after that, basically, Matthew's own inner civil servant sort of dooms them too, because he's constantly calling these people, and it's obviously some pod people at the other end. And at one point, they call his name, and he says, I never told you my name. How do you know my name? Whatnot.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's when he first figures that there's something really wrong.
Right. That he can't trust authority anymore, and that was his anchor. He doesn't know what to do now.
Yeah, he's sort of cut adrift there. So what happens is, I forget whether that happens before he nod. No, then he nods off, and the pod people are coming for those four. They've sort of triangulated where these four remaining human troublemakers are, and they chase them through the night. Goldblum runs off. Veronica Cartwright runs after him, and then the rest of the film we follow Matthew and Brooke Adams, Elizabeth
Elizabeth.
character. Um, and I've wondered, and I think it's a good editing choice because, especially at the ending, we get the Sacco ending with Veronica Cartwright still being found alive, even though her husband has been podified. So we don't really know what exactly happened to it. Did David catch up? David Kibner catch up with Belichick or whatnot? And I think she says, Veronica Cartwright says, they somehow got separated after she
Separated.
ran
Right.
after him. So it brings to mind too that obviously the Night of the Living Dead, because by the last third of the film, I mean, there has to be an overwhelm of the pod people, and they are certainly taking over far quicker than the zombies do, because in any given day in this world, okay, what, maybe 10,000, 20,000 people will die, but the pod people seem to be expanding exponentially,
Exponentially. Yeah.
not just natural death. Um, but so let's talk then about the sort of the scene with the boat. There seems to be a boat coming in. I think it's from South America, perhaps, or Asia, and that gives some renewed hope that they can get away. What is your take on that scene, and then it going? Because by this time they've already been drugged by David, and how the hell they're staying awake, is a little bit of a stretch.
I mean, they do take a whole bunch of barbiturates, but then they get shot with sedatives
Yeah,
by Kibner. So yeah, the fact that they're even able to stay awake is amazing. Um, but the scene with the boat, I like it because it finally it shows you it's that stomach dropping moment where you realize that this is not confined to just here, that this is going worldwide. Um, and also it's the last little bit of hope that Donald Sutherland's character had is now gone, and he's basically lost, and he knows that he's lost. And the thing I like about that is that in the original story, like I said, it has a happy ending. Like it talks about that exponential growth happening, that like once one person is a pod person, then they can infect two more, and then those two, four, and it grows exponentially. but that movie or the book just kind of glosses over that, and the aliens decide, oh, we're wrong, and we'll leave. And then the 56 movie manages somehow to keep it confined to this the small town, and then the military is going to go in or something.
Mm.
I don't really remember. But this one, they knew, the writers knew going into it that they had to address this, and the best way to address it is to just let it happen, to not try to stop it, not come up with some contrived way to end it. Um, so that even when Donald Sutherland is attacking the factory and blowing up their growing area, you know it's futile. You know it's a futile act,
Mm.
but it's just all he knows to do. It's all he can do at that point.
Yeah, and that is basically, checkmate for the human race, at least in this universe here, because after that he has left Elizabeth uh, somewhere outside the plant, and when he comes back, at in the late 70s, this was famous scene where she's frontally naked there, because this wasn't. I don't believe this was an X rating because of that. I think it was an R-rated film, um, and the real Elizabeth crumbles to dust, and the new one,
Just pops
rises.
right up.
Yeah, she
Right.
walks right up naked and whatnot, and even into the factory, and that's when he sort of just he goes on his little 5 minute trope as the hero, and it's obviously at that point. Do you think the average, if you hadn't seen this, do you think that it's in vain, or do you think that there's some last minute Hail Mary that Matthew figures something out?
I don't know. It's hard for me to say since, like, I saw this movie when I was a little kid,
Hmm.
and I've just always known. But trying to look at it objectively, I don't know. It feels like it's still. I feel like I still would see it as being futile. That they're already like traveling all across the state. You've already seen them loading pods into trucks and stuff, and talking about which cities they're going to. That just blowing up this one factory is not going to make a difference anymore.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, of all of the sort of doomsday scenarios that we get in, let's just stick to film. Whether we're talking about vampires, whether we're talking about zombies, whether they're real zombies that are dead or they're infected zombies, like the whole I Am Legend thing, whether they're delusions, let's call them, like in Carnival of Souls, uh, or other quasi they live type thing. The thing about this invasion is Kibner might be right. The world might be better with pod versions here, because they seem to be, once they take over the bodies, they seem to not be stressed. They seem to not, you could imagine that bigotry and racism, that if there was global warming in that universe, that they would figure it out. They seem to be much more rational creatures, whatever we want to call them. It's almost like, if you're going to have Armageddon or you're going to have Doomsday, this is probably the best kind of Doomsday you could have, for
True.
Earth. What is your take on that versus other Doomsday scenarios in a similar vein?
Well, I like it because it's alluring, right? Like I think that goes all the way back to the original novel. Is that the idea is that there is an enticement. There's a willingness to want to let go of the things that make you human if it'll make the world a better place.
Yeah.
Like, and I feel like that is a very powerful idea. And you're willing to let go of your own individuality if you can join a collective that will solve all of society's ills. I feel like that is a very big draw, and you can take that in all multiple different directions. And I think it's part of the human condition. And so, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I got the sense when I first watched this, and just recently when I rewatched it and wanted to do this show, is that of all of the would-be usurpers of humanity, even, let's say, if we include the apes from the original Planet of the Apes series, or the new ones too, their humanity, it's almost like they meet the apes or the zombies or the vampires, and humanity needs to get it. Humanity needs to be taken down. As Dr. Zaius, he gives one of his things about, humans are the scourge of the earth. They ravage the plants. He's not only talking in racial terms, he's talking about, ecology here. But with the pod people, you get the sense that there's not, I think Kibner even says it. It's nothing. They're not out to destroy humanity. They're sort of like, it's a natural process. They have to eat just the way that we eat cows or consume anything. That for them it's either them or us, and it's nothing personal with the pod people.
Yeah, yeah, you definitely get that sense with Kibner's little speech. You definitely feel that way. That they're not here to dominate. They're not here to control. They're just here to survive.
So Eric, let's get towards the ending of the film, and then we'll talk about some of the technical aspects and its reception and legacy, that kind of thing. So after the original Elizabeth is dead, and Matthew has his moment of glory, and taking out one center here in San Francisco. That's pretty much it. He has that little moment of glory, and I think he goes off running, and then we get a cut, and we don't know if is this the next morning, is this 2 mornings from now, 3 mornings. It seems to be the next morning because Veronica Cartwright, when she comes back, still seems to be wearing the same dress and is sweaty and whatnot. But I want to talk, before we talk about the actual ending, if anyone hasn't seen it, this movie really makes use of illusions, things that we aren't seen on screen. What happens off stage, is just as important as what happens on stage. We don't know really what happened when Veronica Cartwright gets separated from Jeff Goldblum. We don't know a lot of little things that happen off stage. And what has happened since the last time for Matthew's fleeting victory to when we see him. The filmmaker, what's his name?
Philip Kaufman.
Kaufman, yeah, he does a really good job here, because when we first see Matthew, then in the last scene, it seems like it's really Matthew, and it seems like he has taken to heart what Veronica Cartwright said before she disappeared, that you just have to pretend to sort of be like them, and they won't notice you. And there's a siren or something, and everyone files out of the buildings, and they're down to distribute more, blah blah blah. And he's walking. I guess it's the mayoral office, or the mayor's mansion, where the pods are now sort of like palm trees in the center of everything. And he's walking, and we as an audience, and I remember when I first saw this, think, okay, this is Matthew, and now he's going to put into motion whatever he's been cooked up over the last night.
Right.
And then Veronica Cartwright comes up there, and within a matter of 30 seconds, we go from, oh, the hero's going to win, to her, Matthew, hi, I did that, and then, and right. Boom. I think it's such a fantastic ending that, we're expecting that heroic trope. We're expecting Matthew Matthew victorious, and then bam. Talk to me when you first saw it, and how you think about the ending now.
Oh, it is definitely one of the best gut punches in all of cinema, for sure. I like how you could even divorce it to a certain extent. Right at the beginning, you see him, like at the beginning of that sequence, you see him like clipping newspaper clippings, which is something that had already been established as something that he does. It's just like a thing that he has. So that gives you a sense that there's still some Matthew in there. Even if you think that he's a pod person, you can still see that there's something. But of course, this could have easily also taken place days before the invasion ever happened. Everybody's just going through the motions. And This could just be another day in the life of these people, that nothing has changed until that siren comes, and then everybody files out, and it gets kind of weird. And then, that gut punch, and Veronica Cartwright just freaking out, and Donald Sutherland pointing at her and screeching with that giant mouth, and the camera zooms into his open mouth. I think it really hammers it home that there's no resisting this kind of insidious problem, and that by the time you realize that there's something wrong, it's too late, kind of thing.
Now, I know that when the film came out, it did fairly well at the box office. It wasn't, a Star Wars level, hit Jaws level, Exorcist level, but it did fairly well. It didn't do as well as Alien did the next year. And critically, it got middling reviews. There were some people who raved about it, some people who hated it, uh, and most was sort of, it's got good points, but is it as good? And the comparisons to the 56. Now, in the last 40 years, though, it's I think really taken on a life of its own, and I think it's probably considered in sci-fi films. It's as one of the top 15 or 20 American-made sci-fi films of all time. It's certainly, I think, in the top handful of invasion film themes. Um, uh, what is your take coming to it later than someone like me? Have you noticed, say, in the last 10 or 15 years, how people look at this more as a classic than they did?
Yeah, I mean, even in the last 20 years, I would say that it has grown in stature. That a lot of sci-fi nerds like myself will talk about it a lot more. Um, that it does definitely stand tall against a lot of the more fluffy invasion movies. Like people love Independence Day because it was a big budget spectacle, but it doesn't have that kind of like cultural prestige that Invasion of the Body Snatchers does. And even in Hollywood circles, Invasion of Body Snatchers 1978 is well respected because it was very cheap to make and it didn't do great, like you said, but it did enough and it was highly profitable because it wasn't expensive. The amount of box office it got was enough to make it really good. Um, and Hollywood's tried a couple of times to seize on that, and we can talk about that later if you want. Um, but no, I do believe that of all the invasion movies, I think this one has the most insidious um, sociological aspects to it. That like it's seeded itself into our collective unconscious.
Now, I've not seen. I think there was Body Snatchers and then just Invasion. Was that with Nicole Kidman?
Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig.
So
Yeah,
I haven't seen them. Have you seen both of them?
I have seen
What
both
What
of
is
them.
your take on them versus the first two, 56 and 78?
Well, I don't recommend them.
No.
The one from the '90s, it takes place on a military base, and it's made by a lot of B movie icons like Stuart Gordon, the guy who made Reanimator and stuff like
Mm,
that. But it's a B movie that wants to be taken seriously, and it doesn't really work.
yeah.
And it's about as subtle as a sledgehammer. I mean, you've got Arlie Ermy dressed in an army outfit, pointing at the camera and saying "conform." That. Come on. It's not very good. It
Yeah.
feels very like direct to video kind. I mean, it was released in theaters, but it's not very good. As for the invasion, the Nicole Kidman, Daniel Craig one, it's not bad, but it's trying to do way too much. It's trying to throw in all these different themes all at once instead of just like focusing on one idea and running with it. And
Mhm.
it's very muddled and very confusing. And also they don't reproduce by pods. They just like it's just like an invasion of like a bacteria or something that it changes people. That's
Uh,
all. It doesn't actually have a pod, and that kind of blows the whole plot for me. It just doesn't
yeah.
seem to work. Then it
So
just becomes the Andromeda strain. It's not that big a
yeah.
deal.
So getting back to the 78 version, let's talk a little bit about the cinematography because I know when I watched it with my wife recently in the last month or so, um, we saw so many different films that was obviously influenced by it. There's a film noir element to it,
Oh, totally.
and most specifically, Third Man. When you look at some of the shots of them running in the night, Third Man is there. M,
Yeah.
M with Peter
And
Lorre.
yeah, totally.
I mean, there's the sense just from the shots that the world is off kilter. Something is wrong. Um,
Yeah, there's
and
a lot of Dutch tilts like to
right.
really highlight that. Yeah.
And also, too, there's a lot of imagery that in some ways is obvious, but not. The most obvious one, was it called the Space Needle? There's that scene when Kibner and Matthew are there talking. I guess it's on Matthew's porch in his
Right,
in the
right.
park.
And the
And
towers
you see,
behind them. Yeah.
was it the Space Needle or some
It's
other?
not the Space Needle. That's Seattle. I
That's
don't
the
remember what it was
yeah,
called.
but it's an obvious phallic thing. Here are the two men talking about it, and the women have been removed. Even though in some ways the women, I think, are the more
They're the
interesting,
ones who have,
especially
yeah.
Elizabeth. I think she's the center of the film, and when her character dies, boom. that it's over. It seems that's it. So what about the cinematography stands out to you?
Well, it's very bold. Like you said, there is kind of a film noir aspect to it in that like playing with darkness. There's a lot of shadows, but there's also a lot of framing where people are put off to the side,
Hmm.
and they're blurred by foggy glass or the splinters on the windshield. There's a lot of filming things through other things, so that there's like this divorced perspective,
Yeah.
but also everything again is off kilter. You know that everything is wrong because it's not nothing is really centered in frame clearly at any point
Yeah.
until the very end when you're zooming in on Donald Sutherland's open mouth. Um, and I think that unconsciously really works on you from the very first frame to the end.
And one of the things that I think goes unnoticed when I read criticism of the film is Jeff Goldblum's character is really the typical Jeff Goldblum character. He's so nervous. He's always talking. As Matthew and Kibner are talking, he's talking behind them, ripping Kibner behind his back and whatnot. But you get, it's almost, what is it though? That little toy that you'll spin on its side. They had it in that Leo movie. As an oscilloscope or something where uh,
Oh
he
yeah.
he uh, Goldblum's character is constantly sort of wobbling, and we don't know whether he's a good guy or a bad guy or whatnot. Is he an idiot? Is he going to end up being the hero? And then after he turns, obviously, uh, he's done for. But there is a sense of realism in here, in that when you talked about the female lead in the '56 version, was it Dana Winter? You said.
Dana Winter, yeah.
Yeah. She's very much a Leave It to Beaver type character, but you get there's a reality, a 1970s mature, if we want to talk Woody Allen-esque kind of feel to Goldblum's character, that he might be the same guy that's on the phone in Annie Hall.
Right, right. No, and if you've spent any time in New York, you've met like 100 of these guys.
I grew up
Like
in New York, so
so again, like he's very quirky and very weird, but at the same time, that's one of the things that grounds the movie is because he's quirky and weird in a very familiar way. We all know people like this. He's very insecure. He's very talkative. He doesn't know when to stop and take a breath. And there's a lot of people, and people react to stress that way, and I think that makes sense.
so I do want to talk though about the music, because the music. It's one of those films that I know when I listen specifically for it, the music seems very good, but by the same token, the music is so in tune with the mood that is seen on screen, that it's one of those rare movies where the music doesn't intrude, but it's good in that it doesn't. What was your? Do you have any opinion about
I
the
am
soundtrack?
I'm fascinated by the soundtrack to this movie. It was done, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a jazz musician,
Yeah,
an experimental jazz musician. And this, I think, is his only film score.
yeah,
And it's very experimental and very weird, but at the same time, it's able to be in the background. You don't really feel it like blaring at you. You don't really
yeah.
notice it, even when it's being weird. Like there's a lot of atonalities, there's a lot of syncopation, and there's a lot of weird instrumentation. There's even some digital instruments in there, which for 1978, that's crazy. And somehow he's able to meld all that into a mood that is underneath. And again, it's more unconscious than conscious. Like it's not hitting you in the face with strange things are happening. As much as I love Goldsmith, that's kind of a trope of Goldsmith early sci-fi stuff. And it really there's like just the scene of Donald Sutherland breaking into Brooke Adams's loft to rescue her. There's this. It's just a stand-up bass. That's all you hear, and it's like somebody just plucking it at random, and somehow that really really works, and it really makes you feel unsettled and anxious and desperate for this moment to keep moving forward. And that's exactly what the movie's doing. This is a suspenseful scene. So yeah, I wish this guy did a lot more movie soundtracks because it's incredible.
Yeah, it reminds me. I don't know if you know the composer Bela Bartok.
No.
It reminds me of Bela Bartok. So he's got a kind of. It's the opposite of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is this da 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 da. bum, 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 bum.
Right.
Instead of this lush, the universe is opening up before me. It's this kind of things are in the dark. It has that sense that even when you don't see the pod people, the music, you get a sense that if you open that door or looked out that window, you'd see a pod person looking up at you, kind of thing.
Right.
And it keeps the viewer on edge. It's almost like not being on a bed of nails, but just having little pinpricks, maybe if your arm was overrun by army ants or something, just nipping at you. And it really, it's one of the most subtly effective soundtracks I think I've ever heard.
Oh, absolutely. It's unsettling.
Yeah,
Even if you listen to it straight without the movie,
yeah,
it's still unsettling, very unsettling. You can
yeah,
still kind of picture, those faces on the bus all looking at you, it yeah. I don't know
yeah,
what else I can say. It's very unsettling.
yeah. And like you mentioned, what's his name? The guy, what was it, Goldsmith? Well, he's the guy who did Planet of the Apes, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Goldsmith
Jerry
did Planet of the
Goldsmith.
Apes.
Um,
Yeah.
but Jerry Goldsmith is somewhere he has that unsettling feel in his soundtrack, but it's closer to 2001 because you just hear a few bars of do do do, and that's Planet of the Apes. Here, this is the kind of thing that if unless you just literally watch the film, you kind of forget. But then when you hear it again, it comes back to you. It's almost like it instills the viewer with a body memory of what it was.
Right. Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's sort of like being the music almost acts like a pod person taking you over and getting you there.
Yeah, like I said, it's insidious.
Yeah.
It's getting under your skin without you realizing it.
So before we wrap this up, let me just ask you: is there anything about the film, the '78 version, or anything else you want to bring in and talk about that I haven't talked about yet? This is the chance. Go ahead.
Well, I do think that it's one of the last great 70s sci-fi movies, before Star Wars changed everything. Um,
Well, it did come out a year after Star Wars.
it did come out after Star Wars. You got a point, but I feel like it belonged before Star Wars.
Well, it's
You
certainly
know
an
what I mean?
adult movie.
Yeah. Um, Nothing against Star Wars,
Yeah.
but this is definitely a lot more mature, a lot more thoughtful. I think a lot more interesting to think about and watch. Um, I don't know. I really feel like it nails that sense of uh, being set adrift, being afloat in society that a lot of people felt in the 70s. And I feel like I can't think of another movie that does it better.
Well, I was going to ask you to give your reasons for why you think it's a great film, but I think that's a good enough reason there. So I will link below to emcgill.com, your own website. People can go find you there. And I want to thank you for spending about an hour talking about this great and underrated film. And
Oh,
it's not
thanks.
just a sci-fi film; it's a great film, I'd say.
Oh, it is a great film on its own. It doesn't have to be sci-fi. Yeah.